What has happened, everybody? James Hancock here, and back today with a Nosferatu double feature discussion in honor of the new film by Robert Eggers coming our way in December. And like a lot of you, I was really impressed with that first trailer, and I eagerly look forward to seeing his interpretation of the story, but more on Eggers later this year. Today, I'm going to be discussing two giants of German cinema, F.W. Murnau and Werner Herzog. F.W. Murnau gave us Nosferatu, a symphony of horror, way back in 1922, while Werner Herzog released his remake, Nosferatu Phantom der Nacht, in 1979, along with an English-dubbed version simply called Nosferatu the Vampire. But I've always kind of disliked that title because it's redundant and it's a little misleading. The word Nosferatu is this old, archaic Romanian word for vampire, meaning like the offensive one or the insufferable one, although it must be said the word's true origins are a little mysterious and unknown. But back in the fall of 1996, I took this Slavic folklore class at the University of Virginia, and the class did an amazing job of breaking down the various myths and legends and beliefs surrounding vampires, and much to my joy, the class placed a huge emphasis on movies covering all the essential classics like The Horror of Dracula or The Fearless Vampire Killers, up through Coppola's 1992 movie Bram Stoker's Dracula, which in 1996 was still a modern movie as far as I was concerned. In any case, I won't claim to remember everything I was taught about folklore in that class. It was nearly 30 years ago, and I was basically smoking garbage bags of pot on a daily basis. But the one takeaway I remember is that many writers and many filmmakers have all made unique contributions to what we think of as like the rules related to vampires and movies. And those rules would definitely differ depending upon which vampire movies you've seen and which novels you've read. But as much as I love reading Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is right over here, over my left shoulder, it differs quite a bit from Murnau's 1922 classic, in part because the writer and the director of the movie, they didn't have the rights to the novel and they were trying to avoid getting sued. They were ultimately unsuccessful, and Bram Stoker's widow nearly sued the movie into oblivion, but luckily a few prints survived, and now over 100 years later, Nosferatu might be the most enduringly popular movie of that entire decade. Like long before I took an interest in silent movies and directors like Buster Keaton or Erich von Stroheim or Charlie Chaplin or Fritz Lang or D.W. Griffith or G.W. Pabst or the legendary F.W. Murnau himself, I'd already seen Nosferatu, and the version that I rented from Blockbuster Video I've never been able to find again. It had a really unusual score where it was like kind of a synth score, or like a weird, evil rock and roll score. But the reason I'm having a hard time putting it into words is because it's been over 30 years since I've seen that version of Nosferatu. So if anybody knows which version of the score I'm talking about, please let me know down in the comments below. But my overall point is that for a lot of people, if they've seen just one silent movie, it's probably Nosferatu, and some might argue that Charlie Chaplin's The Gold Rush or The Kid might be the most watched movie of the 1920s, but here we are in 2024, and Nosferatu is being remade by one of the most talented directors working today, and the irony is that it's not even Murnau's best movie. It's a really, really good movie, with The Last Laugh and Sunrise are strong contenders for his best movie, but for fans of Murnau's intoxicating imagery and photography, Faust from 1926 might be his most visually distinctive and memorable. But long story short, Nosferatu remains one of the most beloved horror films ever made from any era, from any country, and it still looks stunning all these years later, and it still really works well. It's just a kick-ass piece of genre entertainment in spite of being over a century old. And I think it's really interesting that Eggers wants to do a remake of Nosferatu specifically, as opposed to a fresh adaptation of Bram Stoker's novel, because there are a few key differences between the book Dracula and the movie Nosferatu. But as I get into some of the things that I love most about the movie, I think you'll have a better understanding of why Eggers is so fascinated by the flick all these years later. I think it boils down to a couple ingredients, but number one's got to be the photography. The DP was Fritz Arno Wagner, who also worked quite a bit with Fritz Lang, like movies like M. But the shots in this movie, I mean, just everything about it is just absolutely stunning. Like, if for most classic horror movies, they're lucky if they have one great iconic shot. Like some key shots that would come to mind would be like Leatherface spinning around, swinging a chainsaw in the air, and that sort of thing. Like, there are moments that are just burned into our brain when it comes to the history of the horror genre. But Nosferatu's got like 10 different shots where you're like, oh my God, I'd just forgotten like how many just iconic moments there are scattered throughout the movie. And obviously the other key ingredient's got to be just the astonishing performance by the great Max Schreck, my twin brother. And he just looks bone-chilling. Like, even in behind-the-scenes pictures where he's just hanging out on set, you're like, oh my God, is this guy like a real vampire? Which leads to the movie Shadow the Vampire being made in 2000, which is kind of like a fictionalized take on like the making of Nosferatu and how they actually found a real vampire to play the role. But you believe it. Like when you see Christopher Lee walk onto the stage in The Horror of Dracula, like, oh, that's Christopher Lee, looking his best and doing his best version of Dracula. But with Max Schreck, the fangs look almost like rat teeth, and he just looks like a creature of like less supernatural and more like one of the many creatures that we see on display throughout the movie. One of the things this movie does really well is connecting the vampire to other vampires in nature, whether that's flesh-eating plants or like, flesh-eating polyps or whatever the case might be. But there are all these shots of like weird creatures found in nature that are very similar to the vampiric creature played by Max Schreck. But in that this is a silent movie, obviously actors have a very different bag of tricks to use in order to try to achieve a desired effect. And I think the secret to his success is moving very, very slowly, and it just makes him seem that much more eerie. And it's a note that clearly would be very eagerly digested by Klaus Kinski more than 50 years later, because when Klaus Kinski played the same role, although they call him Dracula in the 1979 remake, not Count Orlok, but Klaus Kinski is the master of like the slow motion attack, which is very different from what we see in a lot of contemporary horror films. But I think the body language of Max Schreck is astonishing. He just knows how to, even if it's just his shadow on a wall, he still knows how to get into that perfect position to make it just look fucking stunning. But I think one of the main reasons Nosferatu continues to play so well all these years later is that it actually introduces some really cool new ideas of its own. It's actually quite a dramatic departure from the source material. Once again, they're trying to avoid getting sued. And I know if you follow this channel, you might be thinking to yourself, here's this like total hypocrite who's constantly talking about how shows and movies need to do a better job of adhering to the source material. And I think the one big exception would be if you're going to depart from the source material, then you better do something fucking astonishing and cool and original, something that will withstand the test of time. And the best example of that is something that's now so widely accepted when it comes to the rules surrounding vampire. You might rightly assume that it comes from the novel Bram Stoker's Dracula, but it doesn't. It comes from Nosferatu. Because how many shows and how many movies have you seen featuring vampires where at the end of the movie or at the end of the show, the bad guy gets killed by a ray of sunlight? That does not come from Bram Stoker's Dracula. He's greatly weakened during the daytime, but he can still more or less move around. They even have a line about that in the Coppola film, Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1992. But the idea of a vampire at the end of the movie getting evaporated or just destroyed by the blaze of sunlight comes from Nosferatu, and it's just an absolutely amazing scene where Max Schreck steps in the frame, kind of freezes up, fades away. And that's what leads to so many film historians and film commentators obsessing over the idea of Murnau basically being a filmmaker preoccupied with the transition from darkness to light and the transition from light to darkness. There's even a scene in this obscure French film called The Mother and the Horror from, I think, 1971 or 1972. A bunch of film nerds are sitting around discussing Murnau, and they comment on how his movies like Sunrise and Faust and Nosferatu are also preoccupied with these transitions between light and dark and night and day and so on and so forth. But it all starts here with the killing of Count Orlok at the end of the film, and I just feel like that's one of the best examples I can think of where a movie is departing from the source material, introducing a new cool idea, and here we are 100 years later, and it is like become a, like the number one rule, like in like the official rule book surrounding vampire lore in most adaptations. And it's hard to know who specifically deserves credit for that idea because screenwriter Henrik Galeen, if I'm saying his name correctly, his screenplay was more or less followed by director F.W. Murnau, even going so far as to follow specific shot instructions and that sort of thing. However, Murnau rewrote about 12 pages of the script, so either Murnau or Galeen came up with that idea, but nonetheless, the fact remains they made some really cool, interesting contributions to vampire lore. And one of the ones that I really like from this movie is the association with the occult. Like when the character who in the novel is Jonathan Harker, but here who is Thomas Hutter, I believe is the name of the main character. We'll just call him Hutter. But when Hutter first goes to visit his boss, Knock, great name, great look, but we see Knock going over all these strange diagrams and weird symbols and that sort of thing that have been sent to him by Count Orlok because he wants to buy basically the coolest looking fucking house that you've ever seen in any horror movie, which is right across the street from Hutter, which Knock kind of gleefully announces to his employee. And speaking of that house, it was used in this as well as in Herzog's remake from 1979, but it's called the Salzspeicher in Lübeck. Once again, I don't speak a word of German apart from ordering beer. I'm like, ein kleines Bier bitte, and I know how to say shit, scheiße. But that's the extent of my knowledge of German. If you want to learn a new language, you got to learn how to order drinks, and you got to learn how to cuss. But that location is just jaw-dropping. But once again, going back to the scene, we see Nock going through all these strange symbols, and later on we see Count Orlok looking at another letter with all these strange symbols. And basically the idea is that Belial, one of the lieutenant demons of Satan, played a role in creating Orlok, which is quite an interesting departure from all the myths and legends surrounding the character of Vlad Shepesh, or Vlad the Impaler, who is a real historical figure. And they didn't stop there. One really cool idea introduced in the 1922 film and then taken to crazy, delirious extremes in the 1979 film is the idea of when a vampire is traveling, how they bring rats with them, and they bring the plague with them. And it's kind of hinted at and suggested that like this plague is starting to kill people in town and that sort of thing. And we get a few interesting shots. But in 1979, Herzog was like, I'm taking this to like Black Plague levels. But once again, I love how that ties Count Orlok back to natural creatures in nature who feed on flesh, drink blood, spread diseases, and that sort of thing. It's just a really interesting, unusual kind of interpretation of the supernatural. I feel like sometimes our ideas of the supernatural can be a little bit too locked in stone, but probably the most interesting departure for this movie from the source material is this idea of the wife Ellen, who originally was Mina Harker in the novel, and then she was turned into Lucy in a lot of other adaptations, including the 1979 one by Werner Herzog. But the idea of Hutter's wife Ellen basically having psychic abilities, and we always see her like sleepwalking and having all these strange dreams and that sort of thing. But during arguably the best scene of the entire movie, the first night when Hutter is being attacked by Count Orlok, we see Ellen sitting up in bed and basically reaching out and almost kind of like psychically or telepathically like reaching across the many miles between them and saving her husband. And like Count Orlok even has to kind of pause and register, and that's when his preoccupation with her and obsession begins. And then slowly but surely we learn that a woman who is pure of heart can basically, like, one of the only ways that you can kill a vampire is by a woman who is pure of heart luring a vampire into her chambers and then voluntarily sacrificing herself in order to keep him there long enough until the sun rises. And all that shit comes straight from Nosferatu in 1922. And then Werner Herzog would take these supernatural abilities and amplify them even more with the character played by Isabelle Adjani. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if Robert Eggers takes the ball and runs with it that much further. It makes the second half of the story so different and such a departure from the novel, because in the novel, a bunch of guys basically chase Dracula back to his castle and kill him with a stake. Like, they are back at his home. But in the story of Nosferatu, it all ends in Ellen's bedroom when she voluntarily sacrifices herself to rid this world of a great evil. And speaking of Ellen, she is featured in what might be my favorite shot in the history of the horror genre. Like, it's easy to think about all the iconic shots of shadows coming upstairs or shadows rising up walls and that sort of thing. Like, there are a lot of beautiful shots in this movie. But one of the most eerie and one of the ones that I can't get out of my brain is a cutaway to Ellen sitting on the beach surrounded by all these crosses. And you're like, Jesus Christ, like, is that, like, what is this world in which you live where you're surrounded by so many kind of otherworldly threats where you feel compelled to be surrounded by crosses? Or is this just more of like a graveyard? But it's so bone chilling and it makes you just want to know so much more. And Herzog would do an interesting version with Isabelle Adjani, more than a half century later. But I think there's no beating that original shot with Ellen sitting on the beach where she's just lost in thought, or who knows, maybe lost in some dreamlike supernatural ability of hers. But I just absolutely love and adore it. But the movie also has some shots that are just absolutely fucking hysterical. Like when Count Orlok first arrives in town and he gets off the boat, we see him walking through town holding a coffin under his arm, almost like a surfer, like going to the beach to like catch some waves and that sort of thing. And I've always loved just like how he looks like such a monster, and yet he's just strolling through town like he owns the place, like it's just no big deal. I just love how relaxed and nonchalant he appears. He's like, all right, here I am. I brought the plague with me, and I'm here to feed on all your beautiful women. But another sequence which is just jaw-dropping. And depending upon if you watch the version that's tinted or not, you might think that it's breaking its own rules, because obviously at the end of the movie, he's killed by sunlight. But on the boat sequence, if you're not watching the version that's tinted, it looks like he's breaking the movie's own rules by walking around in daylight. But back then, the cameras were so sensitive and the film stock was so rudimentary, you needed a ton of light to even get a proper shot. And so that's why I like watching the tinted version, because when you're watching the tinted version, it lets you know when it's night and when it's not, and also just gives you a little variety in terms of the overall look. But those scenes on the boat, the way Max Schreck is slowly walking into frame, or the way he comes up out of the from the cabin from below, he just looks so goddamn cool. And once again, we see the rats and the plague spreading. All that stuff is incredible. It's a sequence that so often gets like like done poorly by other movies. Like last year, everybody was freaking out about The Last Voyage of the Demeter, an entire feature film made out of that one sequence. I'm like, you know what? You can keep Last Voyage of the Demeter. I'm just going to watch like this 2 minutes from Nosferatu where they do it much more effectively. And what gives that scene additional urgency is you have all this marvelous cross-cutting going back and forth between the character of Hutter, who's racing home. He's like running over mountains and riding horses and that sort of thing, but he's traveling by land, and Count Orlok's traveling by boat, and it's basically a race against time to see who's going to get back to Ellen first. So before I move on to Herzog, a few last-minute notes I want to call attention to just from IMDb and Wikipedia. This might be the version of Nosferatu that I saw on VHS back in the 90s, but there's a version of the film with a score by the goth metal band Type O Negative. I don't know if that's the version that I saw back then. It's introduced by the late David Carradine, but that might be the version that I'm referring to, but I need to try and hunt that down. Also, I should call attention to the fact that it's not called the Demeter in the 1922 film. It's called the Empusa or Empusa, but that's a reference to Greek mythology. Also, I should give a shout out to the castles used in the movie. There's the Kachtais, I'm sure I'm saying that incorrectly, and there's the Orava, but the Kachtais, which appears as the last shot of the movie, it was notably the residence and later the prison of the Hungarian Countess Elizabeth Bathory, who famously was accused of torturing and killing hundreds of girls between 1590 and 1610, apparently using their blood as in an attempt to sustain her beauty and youth and that sort of thing. But a lot of people have speculated that character is one of the many sources of inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula. And also, one final note, while this movie is a silent movie, there was a score composed way back in the day designed to be performed by a live orchestra. The composer was Hans Erdmann, and the score was used at the film's premiere in Berlin. A bunch of scores have been cooked up for the movie over the years that I think work quite well, because here we are 102 years later and still talking about it, still enjoying it, still remaking it, etc. and so forth. It is one of the great films. It's one of the great horror films, and basically people have been writing about it and talking about it ever since, and I think 100 years from now, people will still be writing about it and talking about it. The movie is just that good. But I think I've showered enough praise on Murnau at this point. It's time to talk about Werner Herzog and his 1979 remake, Nosferatu Phantom der Nacht, starring Klaus Kinski, Isabella Gianni, and Bruno Ganz. So it's tough to know where to start when discussing this movie, but the most obvious place and the easiest place is just with showering praise on Werner Herzog himself. Werner Herzog's one of those legendary directors where the stories behind the making of some of his movies oftentimes surpass or exceed the movies in question. The most obvious example would be the documentary Burden of Dreams, which is all about Werner Herzog making his film Fitzcarraldo. Like, I like Fitzcarraldo, I've seen it a couple times, but Burden of Dreams is just absolutely fucking riveting. Like, if you want to see like what is involved when a cast and crew is required to like quite literally like move a boat over a mountain, all while dealing with people like firing arrows at them and like, you know, being harassed by snakes in the jungle and that sort of thing. Like, I like watching documentaries like Burden of Dreams, but I would never want to work on one of those Werner Herzog movies, mostly because I wouldn't be able to handle the constant ranting and raving and shrieking of Klaus Kinski.
Und das schrei ich nicht! Und du sagst es mir nicht, aber ich schreie aber nicht! Leg mich doch am Arsch weg! Der Moment ist überhaupt gekommen, wo ich dir in die Fresse haue!
Was? And Klaus Kinski worked with Werner, I think, 5 times. So it was Aguirre, The Wrath of God, Nosferatu, Wojciech, Fitzcarraldo, and Cobra Verde. And then Herzog made his documentary, My Best Fiend, all about their collaborations. And I recommend you see all the above, but if you just want to get the full Herzog-Kinski story, definitely watch My Best Fiend. And I don't think Nosferatu is the best of their collaborations. I think that honor still belongs to Aguirre, The Wrath of God, but I do have a lot of love and affection for Wojciech, which came out later in the same year, 1979, as Nosferatu. But when it comes to this remake, Werner Herzog has said that the original film from 1922 is the best German film ever made. And while this movie is a more or less loving adaptation of the 1922 film, it does differ in quite a few areas. Like, first and foremost, he tries to bring back some of the characters' names from the original novel, because I think right before this movie was shot, the novel entered the public domain. But even though he's using the names from the novel, he still sticks to the changing of the names that was often employed by a lot of early movies that were more or less based on the stage version of Dracula. Like, there are a lot of movie versions, like including the Bela Lugosi film, where the characters of Mina and Lucy, their names are swapped. And I think the same holds true in the horror of Dracula as well. Like, there are actually very, very few movies that allow Jonathan and Mina to be kind of the stars of the movie. Here in the 1979 film, it's Jonathan and Lucy, and that shit, it always drives me crazy, but whatever. But Werner Herzog wasn't some giant vampire fanatic. In terms of his preparation for this movie, he knew a little bit about vampire lore, traditional vampire lore. He'd read Bram Stoker's Dracula, he'd seen Nosferatu, and he'd seen Roman Polanski's comedy, The Fearless Vampire Killers, which I strongly recommend. That movie's totally bizarre, totally insane, but well worth watching. But when it comes to the official version of this movie, Werner Herzog has said that the German language version is the true version of the movie, but sadly it's kind of hard to find. On a lot of streaming services, they have Nosferatu the Vampire with the English dub, and he was shooting some scenes in English, shooting some scenes in German. He was basically shooting two versions at the same time, but some scenes that didn't require any dialogue would just be used for both versions of the movie. And I have no problem with steering people toward the German language version. However, there is one major flaw in the German language version, a technical flaw that I have to call attention to. And one of my favorite scenes of the movie when here, not Count Orlok anymore, now he's back to Dracula, but I'll just call him Klaus Kinski. But when Klaus Kinski has his first major encounter with the character played by Isabella Adjani, they did this amazing thing where through practical effects, she's looking in the mirror, she sees the door open, and the vampire's approaching from behind, whereupon he kind of appears over her shoulder, and they start having their big dramatic confrontation. It's a beautiful scene, but there's one technical flaw in the German language version where if you look closely, you can see Klaus Kinski's face drooping down into the mirror when Isabella Adjani moves her head. But if you watch the English language version, her head remains in position, and you never see that flaw. So even if I like the German language version better, for me, that one scene is ruined because the illusion of a vampire not appearing in a mirror is lost due to that one technical flaw. But as far as my overall enjoyment of this movie is concerned, I think I prefer the Murnau film much more. However, there are certain scenes, individual sequences that I really fucking love. Like, I think this movie feels a little overly long, feels a little slow, but there are certain scenes that have such incredible style and such incredible power. They've just been burned into my imagination for all time. And I think it does an interesting thing where the first half of the movie is more or less Jonathan versus Dracula, or Jonathan's experiences with Dracula. And the second half of the movie, it's all about Lucy's experiences battling Dracula. And it just, both halves have some really cool scenes that I want to call attention to right now. So let's start with the opening credits, which are just bone-chilling and eerie. The music throughout this movie is just astonishing, whether it's composed for the movie or some of the classical music that Herzog likes to use. The score absolutely gets a high five every step of the way, but the opening credits, we get all these mummies, and the mummies were actually shot in central Mexico. They're on display at the Museo de las Momias, the mummy museum, in the old colonial city of Guanajuato, about 200 miles northwest of Mexico City. And so even though those mummies are never brought up ever again in the context of the movie, just that eerie music and those mummies, they perfectly set the tone for the movie to come. But once the movie finally cuts to the city itself where Jonathan and Lucy live, that beautiful music continues. I love the score, but the best music in this movie by far is the music that we hear when Jonathan is traveling to Dracula's castle. And I wrote it down. It's music by Wagner. And of course now I'm having trouble finding the note. So when Jonathan's traveling east to the Borgo Pass, the movie gets increasingly atmospheric and stylish as it goes. But there's a sequence where he's sitting on a hill and he looks up, and the camera pans up this mountain. And as it gets up to the top of it, and you see the sun going down, we hear music by Richard Wagner's prelude to Das Rheingold. And every time I hear it, it just sends waves of chills through my whole body. And we hear that music again and again throughout the movie. But goddamn, like, I feel like of all the directors who've ever lived who did a good job of employing classical music in their films, Werner Herzog has to be at the absolute top of that list. I mean, the first film by him that I ever saw is a documentary about the fires in Kuwait called Lessons of Darkness. And once again, he uses a ton of music by Wagner. It's absolutely fucking incredible. And if I'm being totally honest, I don't think the movie gets that good ever again. And Klaus Kinski hasn't even shown up yet, but it's just something about the look of those mountains and that music and that style and that vibe, it always gets its hooks into me. And I just love how all the locals are always describing this world as like a world, like an abyss full of phantoms, like it's another world entirely. And it puts into your head the idea, maybe Dracula's castle doesn't even exist. Like maybe it's just a ruin, but just through the power of, like, you know, the supernatural and his, you know, deals with the devil or whatever the case might be. Once Jonathan gets there, that what you're seeing is a very cleverly crafted illusion. And I think that's a really interesting contribution that Herzog makes to this overall story. And then once Jonathan gets to the castle itself, you basically have the greatest practical special effect in movie history, Klaus Kinski doing his thing. And I just love his body language and his sense of menace, and just like you get the sense that this is a guy who is so bored with life, but also just like lives in constant agony and has a constant sense of longing. But he leans into every single line that he delivers, and I get why Herzog was willing to work with him over and over and over again. Even if working with him, even for 5 minutes, could be the most hellish experience that you could possibly imagine. But if you wanted to do a side-by-side comparison between the 1979 film and the 1922 film, there are a few key sequences that are very similar, like the first night in the castle when the vampire or Klaus Kinski shows up to feed on Jonathan. That more or less kind of unfolds the same way as in the 1922 film, where his wife, here Lucy, but in the 1922 film Ellen, sits up in bed and screams out, and basically through the power of her love for Jonathan, protects him from being killed then and there. And we see the vampire taking notice and pausing, and then getting preoccupied with finding her as opposed to finishing off Jonathan. And there's some great shots. So when Bruno Ganz is exploring the castle and he finds the vampire basically like living under the stone slab with a giant crack in it. And then we even get that great kind of, it was fast motion in the 1922 film, not fast motion in 1979, but we basically see Klaus Kinski loading up a wagon with a bunch of coffins. It's totally ridiculous. Like nowadays, people, if you saw a wagon with nothing but coffins on the back, you'd be like, all right, that's very suspicious looking. But in 1850, when this version of the story is set, maybe it would be less noticeable. But as long as we're discussing side-by-side comparisons, I think one of the areas where this movie is much weaker than the 1922 movie is the journey by Dracula west by boat, where basically we get a few shots of the boat with some eerie music and the dead captain tied to the wheel, but he more or less just ignores that whole sequence apart from one shot of Kinski kind of walking around at night. But I must admit, I was a little disappointed by the way that Herzog went about that scene. On the other hand, once Dracula arrives eventually in Wismar, Germany, there's some things that this movie does really well. Like, case in point would be Renfield, played by Roland Topor, who is just fucking hilarious in this. I mean, he'll just sit there kind of, bursting with laughter at times where you just will find yourself cackling like an insane person right alongside him. Like, there's one scene where two guys are kind of holding him in place, and he just keeps kind of like lunging and trying to get out of their arms, and he just keeps cracking up, and I just crack up right alongside him. But once the vampire is in the city, this is when Herzog really starts to cut loose with the idea of like him bringing a plague with him, where you have all these rats slowly but surely spreading it throughout the city, and this plague goes from like no plague to like total annihilation of the city in a matter of days. And those are some of the best sequences in the movie by far, where you see some people choosing to kind of dance their way into oblivion until death comes for them, or you see one well-dressed family sitting outside eating, and they're with wonderful, marvelous manners. They're having one last great last supper before they all die from the plague. And we see just like coffin after coffin being dragged through the city. And at the very end of the movie, when I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but when Harker tries to have Van Helsing arrested for killing Dracula, there's really not even a police force left to make the arrest, because the devastation on this city has been so complete and so total. Now, there have been a lot of allegations made about the treatment of the rats on this movie, but I will say this: one rat at least got to get some payback, because at the 54-minute mark in this movie, when people are like opening up all the coffins to see what's inside, one person foolishly puts their foot in for some reason, and a rat bites onto the toe of that actor, who turns out to be Werner Herzog himself, who was famous for basically, he was willing to risk life and limb on a lot of films, sometimes just as a way of kind of helping like keep like a good rapport going with this cast and crew. Like on Even Dwarves Started Small, apparently some of the actors got hurt in the process, so Werner Herzog, to basically make things even, threw himself onto a cactus, and apparently to the present day, he still has all these like spikes and needles kind of embedded in his knee that kind of crackle when he moves. Also, I need to add that when Werner Herzog shot this movie, he shot it with a crew of 16 people, which is just astonishing. When you watch the credits of like a big Disney film and you see just thousands upon thousands of special effects artists and that sort of thing, you're like, oh my God, like no wonder your movies cost $400 million to make. But apparently having a crew of 16 people on this was considered quite luxurious for Werner Herzog, because it was twice as big a crew as he had used when he shot Agira, the Wrath of God. And if you watch Agira, the Wrath of God, you're like, oh my God, like the hell and discomfort you must have endured in order to shoot that movie must have been prodigious. But man, Werner Herzog, he basically he doesn't leave any fat on the bone when it comes to his cast and crew. But speaking of cast and crew, I think the best decision he made on this movie wasn't necessarily using Klaus Kinski. For me, it's Isabelle Adjani. In the absence of Isabelle Adjani, I don't think I would have seen this movie nearly as many times. And in the 1970s and early 80s, she was just going from strength to strength, making one kick-ass movie after another, like movies like The Story of Adele H. with Francois Truffaut, or The Tenant with Roman Polanski, or Possession with Andrzej Zulawski. And of course, she also made The Driver with Walter Hill. I mean, she was working with all kinds of great directors in the 1970s, but Werner Herzog really put her to good use. But when I think of Isabelle Adjani, first and foremost, obviously, she is stunningly beautiful, but goddamn, she was just game for anything. She's game for anything here, but obviously everybody loves that scene from Possession when she's down in that tunnel just like ranting and raving and shrieking and screaming and flinging things in all directions. It's like, I mean, that's a scene worthy of Klaus Kinski himself, but she really sells just kind of like the otherworldliness and kind of almost like her supernatural abilities. She's just got so much incredible stage presence in this, and I just think she's like, she's the best part of the movie by far, especially in the final scene where she decides to sacrifice herself to take out Klaus Kinski. And she had a really interesting comment to make about that scene where she said, there's a sexual element. She is gradually attracted towards Nosferatu. She feels a fascination, as we all would think. First, she hopes to save the people of the town by sacrificing herself, but then there's a moment of transition. There's a scene where he is sucking her blood, sucking and sucking like an animal, and suddenly her face takes on a new expression, a sexual one, and she will not let him go away anymore. There is a desire that has been born. A moment like this has never been seen, and a vampire picture. And it's funny, I don't even know if I completely agree with her interpretation of that scene, but I think it's really interesting that was like kind of the thought process she had when it came to her approach to that scene, because unlike in the 1922 film when the son basically kills the vampire, and that's that, here there's a situation where Klaus Kinski is feeding. He kind of loses interest. You can tell, like, oh my, it's almost too late, and you can tell he's thinking about leaving and departing. And the character played by Isabelle Adjani reaches up and grabs him and pulls him back down. And it's a very sexual scene in terms of, like, initially he pulls up her dress, kind of massages her thighs, and he's got his hand on her breast while he's feeding on her. Like, I totally agree there. But for me, when she reaches up and pulls him back down, I always interpreted that as she's heroically sacrificing herself. But I find it interesting that Isabelle Adjani said she is feeling like a sexual desire for the vampire. It's just another way of looking at the scene. And now that I've read her comments, when I see that scene, I can't get her comments out of my head. Now, I've been praising this movie quite a bit at this point without offering any critiques, but let me add one major criticism. I kind of hate the ending and the death of Dracula in Nosferatu, Phantom der Nacht, because we get this great scene where Klaus Kinski realizes like he stayed too long. He stands up, he kind of looks toward the camera, and his eyes are glazed over in white. Whereupon he starts just thrashing around on the floor. I mean, we all love watching Klaus Kinski thrash about, but it doesn't make any sense that he's thrashing about and then just gets really still. And then when Van Helsing arrives, he finishes him off with a stake. And anyway, it's all leading to Herzog's really strange ending where Jonathan turns into a vampire, has Van Helsing arrested, and then rides off to kind of like begin the evil all over again. Just a really unusual, strange ending that doesn't work for me at all. Your opinions and your mileage may vary, but I just love the ending of the Murnau film, and I think you can't fuck with perfection. But speaking of perfection, there's one area where this movie might have an advantage over the 1922 film, and that's the poster by David Paladin. The poster is on my shirt. I think the poster is one of the best posters ever designed by a human being. It's evil, it's kind of erotic, it's very mysterious. It's a total home run. And I like a lot of the posters from back in the 1920s as well, but goddamn, I've said it before and I'll say it again. You will never regret investing a little extra money, time, and effort in finding a great artist to bring your movie to life in poster form. But enough of the movie works well that I think it's well worth hunting down. I've seen it, I don't know how many times at this point, maybe 5 or 6 times. It's got great scenes. It's just not a completely satisfying experience overall. That said, I think it's vastly superior to Klaus Kinski's next vampire movie, Nosferatu in Venice from 1988. I just discovered that this movie exists. Sometimes it's called Prince of the Night. Sometimes it's called Vampire in Venice. Sometimes it's called Nosferatu in Venice. But Klaus Kinski plays a vampire again, but he didn't feel like shaving his head again, so he just has a big old mop of hair. And I watched it on the Criterion Channel, and I'll say it's worth watching for one just awe-inspiring erotic scene featuring the lovely Barbara de Rossi. But apart from that, I think it's Yeah, it's vastly inferior to the 1979 film by Werner Herzog. But there are a bunch of other shows and movies that have used the word Nosferatu in the title, like the recent TV series from 2019, NOS4A2, Nosferatu. I saw 1 or 2 episodes and realized it was not for me, and I bailed. But I'm very excited to see what Robert Eggers does with this material and his own interpretation in 2024. I imagine it'll borrow more heavily from the Murnau film, perhaps a few ingredients from the Herzog film, but something tells me that Robert Eggers, I think he even did like a high school play of it, like 20-something years ago. He just loves Nosferatu. So Robert Eggers, I mean, The Witch is probably my favorite movie by him, but I really enjoyed The Lighthouse. And there were a lot of scenes from The Northman, which I really responded to. I kept waiting for it to kind of find that extra special gear and become like a Conan the Barbarian movie and get really kind of heroic. But anyway, that was not his goal with the movie The Northman. But I think all 3 of his films so far have demonstrated that Robert Eggers has no shortage of talent, no shortage of style, no shortage of vision, and Nosferatu might finally be that big smash hit that he needs to kind of take his career to the next level, where he finally gets to become one of the big, famous, successful auteur directors working today. But I think that's all I've got to say for now. I just enjoyed having this opportunity to shower praise on one of the great directors of the 1920s and one of the great directors of the 1970s. I strongly recommend everybody do the deep dive on both Murnau as well as Herzog. You can thank me later, but they are 2 of the best filmmakers who have ever lived. But who knows, we flash forward 20, 30, 40 years from now, people might be saying the same thing about Robert Eggers if he continues to sustain his track record of quality that he has demonstrated so far. But if you enjoyed this video, thank you for sticking with me. Please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell, and hitting notify all to make sure you get notified about future videos. But thanks again for taking this journey with me, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.